Okay, looks like we're live. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our Rural Housing Roundtable live stream. I'm Marcella. Hello, I use she, her pronouns. I am the state organizer for Futurewise, and we are coming to you live as we are about a quarter of the way through our 2025 legislative session and our statewide Growing Together campaign. If you've been following us, you're probably familiar with our campaign, but this session we are working to prioritize supporting rent stabilization, transit-oriented development, and rural housing solutions to help our state grow together and create equitable, livable communities for everyone, regardless of where you live in the state. Yeah, like I said, rural housing solutions is a big piece of that campaign. So we're going to take some time today to dive into what does that actually look like? What does that mean? What are we focusing on? And I'm joined today by two of Futurewise's experts to do this deeper dive. So if each of y'all could introduce yourself, just say a little bit about what you do and your experience with Futurewise.
Well, good morning, or good afternoon, I guess. I've already blown it. I apologize to everyone. I'm Tim Drahemovich. I'm the Director of Planning and Law, and I review and comment on comprehensive plans and development regulations and provide evidence-based solutions to growth in Washington state and protecting the environment of the state.
Hi, everybody. I'm Alex Brennan. I'm the Executive Director here at Futurewise.
Sweet. Thank you. And again, I'm Marcella, state organizer. So my role is primarily working with folks across the state to get more engaged in the legislative session, making it easy to reach out to your legislators and advocate on the issues that we all care about. But let's get started. I'd love to start at the very beginning, though, for folks that are new to Futurewise or land use. Alex, can you tell us more about the Growth Management Act? What is it, and what is Futurewise's relationship to it?
Yeah. So the Washington State Growth Management Act is state legislation that creates a framework for planning for growth across Washington state. It regulates how cities and counties do their comprehensive plans. It regulates zoning and other major development regulations that are done at the local level, with the idea that these local decisions also have regional or statewide impacts. And so there are certain standards and coordination that we want to have across the state. The Growth Management Act was created in 1990. And if you kind of go back to or think about what was happening in the 1980s leading up to the passage of the Growth Management Act, we were really seeing development happen in a way that was kind of hollowing out our existing cities, and where we were seeing a lot of suburban, kind of low density, single use development in formerly rural areas. We were losing wildlife habitat. We were losing our farms. We were seeing strains on infrastructure, right? Washington State had some of the worst traffic congestion in the country in the late 80s and early 90s. We were seeing strains on the fiscal health of our counties as they were struggling to provide the services and build out additional infrastructure to serve those low density development patterns. And we were seeing kind of an erosion of quality of life that I think a lot of people felt, both kind of on the in urban communities as well as in rural communities, right? And in urban communities, we were seeing disinvestment. We were seeing in suburban communities a lot of new development get built that didn't really have the gathering spaces, the opportunities to connect with neighbors, to get to the kinds of goods and services that people needed. Commutes were getting longer to work. In rural communities, we were really seeing a lot of existing residents be kind of overwhelmed by the growth in folks in those communities without the infrastructure and services to support that growth. And so for all of those reasons, people came together and said, we really need something, a framework for how to change the way that we're growing to achieve some common goals that address those problems that I just mentioned. And so that was the creation of the Growth Management Act. And then those same people that advocated for that legislation also came together to found Futurewise. So Futurewise sort of has in our DNA that we are sort of the stewards of the Growth Management Act, but also that initial intent and that vision for that we can grow in a better way. And that's going to have benefits for our communities, for our environment, for fiscal health of our local governments, and create more equitable places across the state.
Sweet. Thanks, Alex. So before we dive into the specific legislation that the legislature is considering this year, I want to make sure that we are all on the same page and understand what we're talking about when we talk about rural housing. Tim, I would love it if you could run through some of the specific definitions that would be helpful for people to know going into this.
Well, sure, and thank you for the opportunity to do that. Some of these terms have multiple terms and multiple uses, right? One of them is rural. There is a state law that has created criteria in a list for rural counties where the entire county under this law is designated as rural. But that's not the way the Growth Management Act defines rural. Rural is land that is outside of cities and towns and urban growth areas. It is outside of designated farmland, forest land, and mineral resource land. It's areas that have historically had traditional kinds of rural uses, small scale farms, small scale ranches, forests, low density residential development. That is how the Growth Management Act defines rural areas. It doesn't have urban development. It has development that's consistent with those rural uses. Lots are large enough that you can have some cattle if you want, grow some trees if you want, undertake other rural activities. And again, it's outside of urban growth areas. Well, what are urban growth areas? Urban growth areas are cities and towns. Incorporated cities and towns are all within an urban growth area. And then if they need additional land for population or jobs or recreation over the next 20 years, they can be their urban growth area can be larger than just that city or town. So it includes the additional lands that's needed to accommodate growth over the next 20 years. Seattle, for example, is an urban growth area. You probably noticed that. But so is the town of Mansfield in Douglas County or Napavine in Lewis County. All of those are within an urban growth area. And so within a rural landscape, it's not uncommon to have cities and towns that are within an urban growth area, and that urban growth area may extend beyond the limits of those cities and towns. As Alex explained, before the Growth Management Act, in a lot of places, we didn't carefully plan for urban growth and for rural growth and to protect farms and forests. And so we have some legacy areas within the rural area, areas that existed on or before when that jurisdiction started planning under the Growth Management Act. These are often rural villages. These are often crossroads where a highway and a major county road come together, and there might be a store or a couple of stores and some houses, or maybe even a subdivision or two that was created before the Growth Management Act that has higher densities. Those are referred to as limited areas of more intense rural development. And the idea behind limited areas of more intense rural development is that local governments would draw a line around them, and they would allow them to continue to be used for those uses that they have historically been used. So lamerids, for example, can be referred to as mixed-use lamerids, where you have residential uses and more residential uses are allowed within that lamerid at the densities and form that they did before. You may have commercial uses, you can have industrial uses, you can have manufacturing uses. So they can be mixed use. They can also be single purpose. They can just be a residential subdivision that was created. All of those are classic lamerids. And they're sometimes called type 1 lamerids because of the subsection of the GMA they're authorized by. There's also two other kinds of lamerids, and you can actually create those now. One is primarily for tourism uses. The other is primarily for industrial and manufacturing uses. So those lamerids are either pre-existing areas that existed before the GMA or these other kinds of lamerids as well. Within lamerids, you can have the public facilities and services that are needed to support that lamerid. And by definition, those public facilities and services aren't urban services. Urban services are services that counties and cities plan for and provide in urban growth areas. They include, of course, streets, they include transit, they include water, sewer, and stormwater. Those are the classic urban services. It's the kind of services you typically see in a city or a town. And, depending on the cities or towns, they may differ. But generally speaking, the Growth Management Act doesn't allow urban services outside the urban growth area unless there's an environmental problem and there's no other solution to it. But lamerids, they can have similar kinds of services to serve the kind of development that is in those areas. Sometimes one of the issues that comes up and one of the concerns that exists about residential and commercial industrial development is the rural areas. Where are they going to get the water? In Washington state, our surfaces and groundwaters are owned by the people of the state. But you can get a legal right to use that water. That's what's referred to as a water right. And a water right can either be a formal document that you apply to the Department of Ecology for and that they issue for you, or you can obtain a water right through use. For example, if you have a small well that serves a house and a garden and other similar kinds of related uses, you can use what's called a permit exempt well. You don't need a permit from ecology to do it. And when you start using that well for those purposes, you have a water right as well. So a water right is the right to use water. And oftentimes we think of those as residential wells and do it. But of course, you can get water rights for cities. Well, in fact, cities have to have water rights usually. In towns, they'll have water rights too. You can have industrial uses that have water rights. And of course, many farms and ranches have water rights to water their cattle, to irrigate their crops, for uses like that. So that's what a water right is. And I'm almost done. You can relax. The last term I'm going to define is the wildland-urban interface. And this is an area where suburban and even urban uses mix with grasslands, with forests, with sort of wild places. It's an intermix zone that you might have residences and those other kinds of uses. Oftentimes these are in the rural area, but there are areas within cities and towns that are also within the wildland urban interface. And why you've probably been hearing that term more and more is, unfortunately, these areas are very susceptible to wildfire, particularly as our state is drying out and we're seeing more wildfires occurring in places that they historically haven't been, or maybe they've been there historically, but we didn't have people living there. or businesses there. And so they're now more of a problem. And it defines the area where you're at risk for these wildfires affecting suburban and urban-like development. And these areas are mapped. The State Department of Natural Resources has a map that shows the wildland-urban interface areas. The legislature in the last session required them to update that map. They've done it, and so it's mapped. And I'd be happy to answer any questions when we get to that, but thank you for the opportunity to talk this afternoon.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Tim. Thanks for those definitions. I think it's really helpful too to think about how do we talk about specifically rural when we're just, everyday language talking about it versus how it is defined in the Growth Management Act. Like my sister, she identifies as having lived in a rural area, but it was a small town. It was 4,000 people. Yeah, I was surrounded by farms, but according to the GMA, that wouldn't be considered rural. So I think that's really helpful distinction of the way that it's talked about in these bills and policies specifically. Okay, now that we've got some definitions, we're all on the same page here. I'd love to hear a little bit about the housing policies in urban growth areas and how that relates to housing policies in rural areas. Alex, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, for sure. For us, we really see the work that we're doing in urban areas and the work we're doing in rural areas as being very interconnected. And there's several different kind of ways that those things are connected. So I think the first and maybe most kind of simple connection is there's a lot of people that want to live in an urban area. They want to live close to work, or they want to live in a neighborhood where they can walk to, a coffee shop and stores and their friend's house, but they can't afford it. And they're living in a rural area, not because that's where they want to be, but because they've been priced out of the urban area that they're trying to be close to. And so, one of the big focuses for us has been how do we create more housing opportunities in those urban areas? How do we create affordable housing opportunities in those urban areas? How do we build the variety of housing types that meet kind of the variety of different households and their housing needs? And you can see from prices, right? This is an issue that wasn't as big of a problem in 1990 when the Growth Management Act was originally passed. It's become a much bigger problem over time since then. And so we really need to be finding more ways for people to be able to live in those urban communities where they want to be and where is going to set them up for success. And so that's, a big part of the advocacy that we've been doing over the last couple of years and are continuing to do, whether that's through the transit-oriented development policies that we're trying to get passed in the state legislature this year, or through the missing middle housing options that we worked to pass in 2023 that allow this sort of variety of kind of smaller scale infill housing options in urban areas, or through the overhaul to the housing element of comprehensive plans that HB 1220 that we worked to pass in 2021. So that's a really important part of the kind of first part of the connection between kind of housing needs and housing affordability in urban areas and in rural areas. The second kind of related piece to this is thinking about costs holistically. So if you just look at what the rent is or what the home price is, and you compare an urban area versus a rural area, a lot of times that rural home will look cheaper. But there are two things that are often kind of missing from that picture. The first is the cost of providing the infrastructure and services in those rural areas. And this is also sort of goes to providing that in that sort of low density suburban development pattern that's kind of in between those things. A lot of like infrastructure, for example, right? If you're building a pipe, for every mile of pipe you build, the more people that you're serving with that pipe, the more cost effective it's going to be to build that pipe per person served. And so when you have lower density areas that are going to need that type of urban services, as Tim was describing earlier, it becomes much more expensive if you're having to run really long pipes out to serve a small number of people than if you're able to do that in a denser urban area. Similar things for services, right? If you have a lot of people, if you have sort of a lot of people scattered in rural areas that are in the wildland urban interface, and you have to have fire service to protect all of those people, that is going to be much more expensive than having a smaller number of folks that need that kind of fire service, and having your fire service more focused on urban areas where you're going to be able to get to any fire pretty quickly, serving a lot of people in a dense area. And a lot of those infrastructure costs are not actually paid for by the developer or the property owner or the homeowner. Right? A lot of those infrastructure costs are subsidized because we want to make sure that everybody in Washington State has the basic services that they need. But that does create this sort of incentive problem where that then can make those homes in places with where the services are more expensive to provide look cheaper than they actually are to society, because we're sort of building in those subsidies to those places behind the scenes, and the person isn't actually paying that, who's living there. The other cost connection I think is really important is the household costs besides the rent or the mortgage that you're paying. And the biggest of those is transportation. And so we really think about housing and transportation costs for a household as being kind of connected and combined. You might be able to live someplace where the actual rent is significantly cheaper, but you're going to have to drive a lot more to get where you need to go to meet your basic needs. And that's going to be a lot more expensive, right? All the gas you're going to pay for, the wear and tear in your car, versus being something where you're really close to your job, you're really close to the store, you can do more of those trips by walking or hopping on the bus. So those are other ways that we're trying to create more affordability by creating more communities where people have lower transportation costs. The other key piece of this, or I think, the other thing that I think is important to think about is, and this is kind of going back to how can we help people that want to be in urban areas be in those urban areas to not create kind of the pressures and competition for limited housing in rural areas. We also look at this in kind of urban areas of high displacement risk, right? We know that some communities are more at risk for displacement. They're more vulnerable to being priced out, even of their urban community. And that can be because they're renting and they're not owning. It can be because their overall financial situation is more precarious. And so we want to put in place some protections and strategies for helping folks stay in those communities. And that's true for a lot of rural communities too, right? Where we're really trying to figure out how can we protect and support the folks that are really connected and embedded in that rural community, and from pressures from other folks that might not have those connections, but we have lots of really beautiful rural communities that lots of people would like to own a home in, maybe even if they're not really living there full time. And then I think the other piece of this is that we work on these more kind of supply and land use related strategies but we try and show up as allies for other comprehensive affordability solutions. And so, this year we're doing a lot of work in a support role on the rent stabilization policies that the legislature is considering. We have historically supported things like the State Housing Trust Fund and other funding strategies for subsidizing housing for the lowest income or most in need folks in our community. So we want to continue to do that.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Okay, so you might all remember or even participated, for the folks that are watching, that last year hundreds of Futurewise supporters and folks on our campaign team worked to defeat some bills that would have doubled the housing capacity in rural areas. Tim, can you remind us what our concerns were with those bills and why we worked so hard to defeat them?
Sure, I'd be happy to. There are a number of reasons why doubling your rural densities by allowing 2 houses on every lot is a problem. One of them is that the Growth Management Act was adopted to save taxpayers and ratepayers money. As Alex said, in the rural area, it's more expensive to provide the facilities and services that are needed to serve them. A 2024 study showed that in the rural area, it costs 39% more to accommodate a house than it does in a city or a town. So it's much more expensive. And we already have significant problems affording our existing capital facilities. As you may have heard, the state transportation budget has a significant deficit right now. A lot of these rural developments impact state highways, and so we just don't have the money to put in the state highway improvements, the safety improvements, the public facilities and services that are needed to do it. There are also significant environmental impacts. In Washington state, pretty much all of the water in the state is already allocated. So when people move out beyond existing water systems and sink permit exempt wells, they're using water that somebody else already has the right to use, or that has been set aside to support salmon and fish and wildlife through in-stream flows. And as those flows get lower and lower in the summer and the fall, that significantly adverse impacts salmon, fish and wildlife, and other uses of the stream. It can also take water away from senior water rights holders, such as farms and ranches. And so there's both environmental impacts, there's economic impacts. There are other environmental impacts. When we increase impervious surfaces within a river basin and we remove native vegetation from that river basin, when we get to about 10% impervious surface in that basin and we get below 65% native vegetation, there's a very significant impact on the water quality in streams and rivers. It's a very noticeable threshold that when you pass, and that adversely affects salmon, that adversely affects other fish and wildlife. That's one of the reasons why the governor's task force, Governor Inslee's task force, to see how we can protect and recover the orcas, said we need to grow up, not out. It's because of this adverse impact on rivers and ultimately Puget Sound. There are other impacts as well. More development outside cities and towns means there's more people in the urban wildland interface that I talked about before. And one of the facts about wildfires is that most of them are caused by humans and human activities. Not necessarily arson. In fact, just a small proportion are caused by arson, but they're caused by other activities. Somebody burning brush on their property to clean up their property can start a wildfire. Unattended campfires, unattended backyard fire pits, other kinds of uses, people driving on roads and creating sparks, all of those things. So the more people we put in that interface, the more fires we're going to have. And of course, the greater the potential for damage, because now we've got a house where we didn't have a house before. So there are many environmental impacts. There are those impacts on public facilities and services, including the state transportation budget. And of course, there's impacts on local government finance that directly impacts taxpayers and ratepayers. And those are the major concerns that we have by doubling the capacity of the rural area, as those detached ADUs bills would do. And one of the important things to note too is that as it's written right now, the Growth Management Act allows accessory dwelling units in the rural area. They just have to be internal to an existing building or house, or they have to be attached to an existing building or house. And those are the most economical accessory dwelling units. If you can take a basement and renovate it, or if you can add an ADU in an existing garage, that's going to be way cheaper than building a separate house in the rural area. And those are allowed right now by the Growth Management Act. We support them. And they don't have as many impacts on the environment and the economy as before, because an internal ADU or an attached ADU uses less water than a separate detached house, because a lot of water is used outside of the facility. And if you're an existing garage or an existing house, you don't add to that. Similarly, you're not adding new structures to the rural area that are greater for wildfires, and you're not having that impact from increased impervious surfaces and a loss of native vegetation.
Okay, that's a helpful clarification, Tim. Thank you. Okay, so that was last year's legislation, but this year we find ourselves in somewhat different scenario, mostly because of the work that we did last year, and like so many folks reaching out to legislators saying that we don't support these really harmful bills. But this year, legislation has been introduced again on rural issues, and the Futurewise position is other, meaning that's how we sign in when we are at hearings. But Alex, can you tell us more about what's going on this year?
Yeah, I think one of the, well, let me back up for a second. So, last year, part of what happened was that the proponents of the rural ADU bills didn't really talk to us, and they just sort of wanted to get those things passed and not try and address the various concerns that Tim outlined. And there just really wasn't enough time. If you remember, last year was a short legislative session too. Because we hadn't been having conversations before session started, there really wasn't the time to address these complex policy issues, develop new language in a meaningful way that we thought we could actually do to address those concerns. And so a big part of our push was that this was happening too fast. We needed to take a minute, have time outside of session to see if there were some places where we could find agreement. So luckily the legislature agreed with us on that. And we have had that time in the intervening months to work with folks that are trying to find ways to meet housing concerns that they have for their communities. I think that one of the biggest differences between the bills this year and last year is the way that they interact with the overall growth targets or growth allocation for rural areas. And this is something I don't think we've touched on already. So maybe I'll try and give a little bit of an overview of how this works. So within the Growth Management Act, every jurisdiction kind of gets through a complicated distribution process that starts at the state level and kind of goes down through layers of government. Everyone ends up with a growth target. This is sort of how much they should be expected to grow over the planning period. And the the idea is that then the zoning and the other development regulations, the capital facilities planning to serve that growth is all based on that target. And I think the kind of most central concern that we had about the rural detached accessory dwelling units was that the bills last year proposed that second structure, right, that looks like a second house and functions like a second house in terms of, how it's built, the fire and water, stormwater service impacts of it, was not being counted as a second house. And so, you have, this growth allocation for a rural area in a county. Let's say that growth allocation is 5,000 new homes in that area. If on each of the places where you could build one of those homes, you can actually now build a detached accessory dwelling unit that looks and functions like a whole separate home. Suddenly you're going from 5,000 new homes to 10,000 new homes. And in addition to that, so for this hypothetical 5,000 new homes, right, that is the sort of planned growth for that area. When the county is doing its comprehensive plan, if it's going to grow by 5,000 additional households in the rural area, they need to come up with a capital facility strategy for how are they going to serve all those people, right? They need to come up with a water mitigation strategy. How are they going to address the impacts on the water system of all of those folks taking more water out of rural wells that we don't have really good systems for regulating? There's a variety of other impacts that the county would be addressing upfront in the planning process based on what that target is. And so these bills were just kind of exempting all of this potential growth from the systems that we have in place for mitigating those impacts and planning for those impacts and providing the services that are needed. And so what's different this year is that the counties and the developers are trying to work with us to figure out how could we incorporate these new detached accessory dwelling units into the planning process and have them be, not try and just pretend that they're not really there and we're not going to mitigate for them, but instead accept them and figure out ways to then make other types of policy changes that would compensate to reduce growth in other parts of the rural area, to kind of keep the overall rural growth the same as the target that they were supposed to have. And so that's, I think that's a really fundamental kind of change in the framework of thinking and a recognition of the validity of the concerns that we brought to the legislature last year. I think that the tricky part is in how do you actually design a program that does that? And especially given that a lot of, in the Central Puget Sound, the counties have already adopted their comprehensive plans. They've already kind of set their zoning and development regulations for these rural areas. If we come back now and suddenly allow another building on rural lands, what can we do sort of to go back and revisit the planning decisions that have already been made? So we're in this place now of trying to work with the legislators, work with the proponents of these bills to see if we can come up with a good way to do that. And there's really two policies that are kind of in conversation this year. There's the rural accessory dwelling units, which we've talked about the most so far because that was the big focus last legislative session. The other thing that's a big part of the conversation is some proposals around allowing more missing middle housing types in LAMERDs, those kind of areas that kind of predate the GMA that have maybe a slightly higher density of homes and maybe a little store or something, but are not actually officially towns. And so those places potentially have more services. They're a little bit better set up for growth. But in most cases, they don't have things, for example, like water and sewer. And so if they're going to be using septic tanks and kind of managing their stormwater runoff on site without a water and sewer system, that is potentially challenging for higher density development because you need a certain amount of space next to the building to do that. So just as one example, I think there's a variety of complications with allowing those denser developments in landmarks as well. And then thinking more holistically too about if that means overall the growth in those landmarks is bigger. That's again part of the overall rural area growth that the county was supposed to be planning for with the target that they were given. And so there need to be some other things done to make adjustments there. So that's why we're signing in other at the moment, because we think that we appreciate that folks are negotiating in good faith with us, that they've spent time in conversation with us before session, and we hope that there's a path to addressing those concerns in a meaningful way. But we still have concerns, and we don't feel like that path has completely been figured out yet. And so there's still a lot of work to do.
Well, thank you, Alex. For folks that are following along at home, the Rural Detached Accessory Dwelling Unit Bill is HB 1345. And if you've already been getting our updates, you're probably pretty familiar with that bill. Okay, but I'm curious, what are ways that we can support housing affordability in rural areas or cities and small towns in rural areas that doesn't threaten our water supply or overburden services that we already have?
So, and to a large extent, these are strategies that we've already been talking about, right? And so to recap a little bit, I think our preferred strategy for doing this is to see more housing and more affordable housing options in the towns that serve these rural communities. Right? And I think this goes back to the definitions we were talking about earlier and kind of the example that you were giving, Marcella, about your sister. When most people think of a rural area, they include those towns in those places. And, when we talk to rural communities that we work with and rural community organization partners, farmer organization partners, they really see the best opportunities for affordable housing options that serve those rural communities are in those towns. And that goes back to a lot of the other things that we talked about in terms of that's where it's more cost effective to provide services, where there's the infrastructure in place. And so those infrastructure costs are going to be lower. Those places are then therefore also more set up to have slightly higher density. You could actually have like a townhome or a duplex, or maybe even a small apartment building, depending on the size of the town and the types of infrastructure that are there. And that's when you're really going to be getting to use land more efficiently, and you're also going to be more able to take advantage of the types of affordable housing funding programs that our state has to make those places more affordable. So that's, and you're going to be living in a place where, there's a town main street that ideally you can even walk to. You're going to be able to kind of live your daily life in a more cost-effective way too. So I think that's the biggest strategy that we're always the most interested in figuring out. I think one of the things to remind folks with the missing middle housing bill, HB 1110, our initial goal was that we would be allowing those housing types in smaller cities and towns around the state as well. Ultimately, as part of the negotiations with the Association of Washington Cities, the smallest of those cities and towns were kind of removed from those requirements. So they have the option of doing that, but they're not required by the state to allow those housing types. They are required to allow accessory dwelling units. And that is something that we want to see in those towns. And we want to find ways to work with those towns to enable some of those other missing middle housing types too. So that's number one. I think number two, Tim already mentioned attached accessory dwelling units. And that these are the more affordable type of accessory dwelling units. It's something that's already allowed by the Growth Management Act. It's something that we support when we work with county governments on their zoning and plans. And so, we think that there's opportunity there for that housing option. The other thing that unfortunately we don't have legislation up for consideration this session because there's some more work to do to fully understand the challenges here. But there are supposed to be provisions, or there are provisions in the Growth Management Act for allowing housing for farmers and farm workers in situations where other housing in rural areas would not be allowed. But in a lot of cases, counties don't have good systems set up for distinguishing between those users of housing and easily permitting that type of housing. So, if you have a family farm and your cousin wants to, move out and join you helping take care of the farm, and you want to build an additional home on your farm to do that, you should be able to do that. There's no state laws that prevent you from doing that, but the local permitting systems are often not very good. And so we're trying to find ways to address those needs as well. And then I think finding some paths forward for allowing the detached accessory dwelling units and allowing some more missing middle housing options in landlords, if we can figure out how to address the negative local impacts on the environment, on the food system, on services, and make sure that that's really incorporated into the planning process in a meaningful way. We still don't think that those are options that are really going to lead to a lot of affordability, but because there are other folks that want to see that as part of the solution, we're trying to find a way to get there that addresses our concerns. And I think there's a couple of the other kind of companion policies that we haven't had a chance to talk as much about. And Tim, maybe this would be a good moment. It's jumping back a little bit, but to talk about a little bit more about the wild and urban interface and some of the wildfire issues that we're working on.
Sure, Alex, I'm happy to. One of the bills that's being considered by the legislature this year is House Bill 1254. Last year, the legislature passed a bill that required DNR to update its urban wildland interface map, which I mentioned before, and which they've done, and then required a state agency called the Building Code Council to adopt a piece of the code that has been put together for the wildland urban interface. And the problem with that bill was it only adopted parts of it that related to hardening structures. It didn't include all of the cost-effective measures that can be used to protect houses from wildfires, including making sure that you don't store firewood near your house, that you've got 2 ways out, that you have a landscaping plan that doesn't have flammable vegetation right near your house, that doesn't allow trees to overhang your house, those kinds of things. So 1254 would have the Building Code Council adopt the whole code for the wildland urban interface. And so it would substantially increase protections for structures within that interface. And because those structures would be more resilient to wildfire spread, it would protect the neighbors as well. And so that's a bill that's currently being considered, and would increase protections for new buildings primarily, but it would also protect existing buildings because they're less likely to get fire spread from new buildings. And so that's up for consideration. As we saw down in California, this is a growing problem and we need to address it. We have people in the wildland urban interface right now. We need to protect them.
Yeah, and especially if we are experiencing a housing shortage and a housing crisis, like, yes, we need to be thinking about how to build more homes within the cities that we already have, but protecting the ones that we've already built is going to be a really critical piece of that as well. Okay, well, thank you, Alex and Tim, for joining us. Do y'all have any last thoughts you want to share?
Just one other thing I want to add. We didn't talk as much about kind of who's going to use the housing that does get built in rural areas. And I think one other kind of aspect of this that's related to affordability and related to kind of particularly meeting the local workforce housing needs is that, I think we have concerns about the detached accessory dwelling units or other types of new housing that would be allowed in rural areas that just ends up being used, whether it's for short-term rentals, for second homes, vacation homes, or even for people that are sort of, digital nomads, can work remotely, aren't really connected to that local community, but just sort of want to be on their computer in a beautiful place. We really want to see if we are going to be allowing more housing options in rural areas, that they're focused on meeting the housing needs of the people that are really embedded in those rural communities. And so that's another really important piece of this conversation and something that we're working with folks on.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Tim, any last thoughts?
Just thank you for tuning in and watching. Appreciate it.
Yeah, huge thank you, Tim and Alex, to you for taking the time to do this deep dive on rural housing for us. And thank you to everyone that tuned in. If you want to get more involved, I can post a link in the comment section, or you can find a link on our website to sign up for our weekly legislative updates email. We send updates on all of the bills that we just talked about and more, and give you a really clear idea of what's the best way that you can make your voice heard to advocate for these bills or against. So please sign up for that. We make it really easy to get involved. And if you do have any questions, you can always send me an email. My email is marcella@futurewise.org. And I can get you connected with folks that can give you the answers or help you get more involved. But thank you again to everyone. Appreciate the time.
That's all.